Harlem, 1940. Frank Costello crushed every gambling street Bumpy Johnson built without firing a single bullet. 3 dens locked and dark before dawn. Over $200,000 gone in one night. No war, no warning. Just a king watching his empire bleed out through cracks he never sealed. To understand that, we go back to the night Harlem still believed no one could touch it. Harlem breathed differently at night. Not the clean air of parks or the sharp cold of open avenues. This was something thicker. Cigarette smoke cut with cheap cologne, fry grease drifting out of kitchen windows, and underneath it all, the warm metallic smell of cash changing hands in rooms that had no signs on the door. Every block had a rhythm. Every corner had a keeper. And as long as that rhythm held, Harlem belonged to the people who built it. By 1940, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was the man who kept that rhythm alive. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He never needed to be. Bumpy stood 6 feet tall with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, a reminder from a younger, less patient version of himself. He dressed well. He spoke carefully. He remembered every face, every debt, every promise made under dim light in the back of a barber shop or a church basement. Men who had known him for 20 years said the same thing: Bumpy didn't run Harlem with his fists. He ran it with his memory. His operation touched everything. The numbers game, what people uptown called the policy racket, was his spine. Every morning, runners would walk the blocks collecting bets from housewives, porters, cab drivers, anyone who had a quarter and a dream. The winning number was drawn each afternoon, and Bumpy's bankers paid out the winners and pocketed the rest. Clean, quiet, and brutally efficient. On a good week, the operation moved close to $50,000 through Harlem's invisible economy. The cops knew. Of course they knew. But the cops on the uptown precincts had been eating from Bumpy's table for years, not all of them. But enough. The ones who asked questions got transferred. The ones who understood the arrangement got Christmas envelopes thick enough to make a man's hand heavy. It wasn't corruption in the way politicians talked about it in newspapers. It was infrastructure. It was the fog that kept the machine running, without anyone having to see the gears. Bumpy had built that infrastructure piece by piece over 15 years, and he was proud of it, not in a way he would ever say out loud, but in the way a man presses his hand flat against a wall he built himself and feels the weight of it holding, which is why the rumors from downtown made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. They came in small pieces at first. A bookmaker on 126th Street mentioned that a man in a good suit had come by asking questions about weekly volume. A numbers banker named Roosevelt told Bumpy that 2 of his best collectors had been approached by someone offering them 30% more to switch operations. A precinct sergeant who owed Bumpy 3 favors called late one Tuesday night and said only this: "There are names being spoken downtown that you need to know about." The name was Frank Costello. Bumpy knew who Costello was. Everyone in the business knew. Costello was the financial brain of the Italian underworld, the man who had watched Lucky Luciano get deported and quietly absorbed Luciano's power without ever raising his voice above a conversational tone. He didn't run numbers. He didn't run dice games. He ran systems. He ran people who ran systems. He was the kind of man who could look at an entire city and see it not as streets and buildings, but as a balance sheet with untapped columns. And Harlem, with its $50,000 a week moving through invisible hands, was an untapped column. Bumpy sat with this information for 3 days before he said a word to anyone. He sat with it at his regular table at the restaurant on 7th Avenue, eating his eggs cold because he forgot about them. He sat with it at a rent party on 133rd Street, watching people dance while his mind worked equations that had nothing to do with music. He sat with it late at night, alone, turning a silver dollar over and over in his fingers until the edge was warm from his skin. He understood the geometry of what was coming. Costello wasn't going to send soldiers into Harlem with guns. That was not his method and never had been. He was going to do something far more dangerous. He was going to make Harlem's own people question who their loyalty belonged to. He was going to offer the bankers better margins. He was going to make the cops an offer they couldn't refuse and didn't need to announce. He was going to pull the threads of the machine until the whole thing loosened from the inside. So Bumpy made his decision. He would stay quiet. He would not show his hand. He would watch the moves come and trace them back to their source before he did anything that could be used against him. Silence. He had learned long ago, was the only weapon that couldn't be taken from you. What he did not fully account for was how his silence would be read by everyone watching. Because in a neighborhood that survived on signals and interpretation, a king who said nothing in the face of a threat was a king who might already be afraid. Nobody who lived through that period remembers it starting with a confrontation. What they remember are the handshakes men from downtown moving through uptown rooms, smiling too easily, staying too clean for the neighborhood they were walking through. That detail stuck with people longer than anything else. The handshakes that didn't leave a mark, but somehow changed everything they touched. Frank Costello's office didn't look like a place where empires were taken apart. It looked like a room where a careful accountant managed a modest import business which was, in a way, exactly what it was. The desk was mahogany. The lamp was brass. The ashtray was always clean because Costello himself didn't smoke. He didn't drink either. Not much. A man who wanted to stay sharp in a business full of men who dulled themselves with whiskey and ego had to make certain sacrifices. He was 50 years old in 1940. His hair was silver at the temples and his suits were made on Savile Row by a tailor who asked no questions about the source of the money. He had the face of a banker, symmetrical, unreadable, patient in the way that only men with long memories are patient. When he spoke slowly. His lawyers said it was because he wanted to be understood. His enemies said it was because he was always thinking 3 sentences ahead. On the wall behind his desk, he kept a single-framed map of New York City. No markings, no pins, just the map. He didn't need the pins. He kept the geography in his head, block by block, precinct by precinct, with the kind of precision that made the men who worked for him genuinely uncomfortable. Harlem had been on his mind for 2 years. Not because of the violence was a management problem, and Bumpy Johnson ran a tight operation that kept the street noise down. What interested Costello was the volume, $50,000 a week, conservatively, running through a system that answered to no one outside its own zip code. No standardized payout rates. No centralized ledger. No structured relationship with the downtown networks that could protect it if the political winds changed. It was, from Costello's perspective, a beautiful machine being operated by a man who didn't understand that beautiful machines needed to be part of a larger system to survive. He didn't hate Bumpy Johnson. He didn't fear him. He studied him. He sent 2 men uptown, not soldiers. Never soldiers at this stage, but representatives. Men who wore good shoes and carried leather briefcases and knew how to sit across from a numbers banker and discuss margin percentages without anyone in the room feeling threatened. These men visited 7 of Bumpy's top bankers over a period of 6 weeks. They didn't make demands. They made presentations. They showed numbers. They explained, very quietly and very clearly, that the downtown networks could offer protection that Bumpy's arrangement with the local precinct could not, because local precinct arrangements were only as good as the captain who honored them. And captains got transferred. 4 of the 7 bankers listened. 2 of those 4 started routing a portion of their weekly take through Costello's collection points before the month was out. Then came the collectors. Bumpy's operation ran on about 40 street-level collectors, men and women, who walked specific routes every morning, taking bets, passing receipts, carrying cash in brown paper bags through the arteries of Harlem. These were not highly paid people. They made enough to live, enough to feel connected to something larger than themselves, and enough to feel the threat of losing it if they made a wrong move. Costello's people identified the 12 most financially stretched among them and made contact through intermediaries, a cousin who owed money, a girlfriend who worked in a dry goods store that was quietly connected to a Costello-adjacent supply chain. The offers weren't dramatic. $20 more a week, sometimes $30. In 1940, $30 a week was the difference between a man eating well and a man eating badly, between a woman making rent and a woman making excuses to her landlord. 6 collectors switched. Bumpy found out about 3 of them within 10 days. He handled it quietly. As he handled most things, the collectors were replaced, and the message went out through the invisible communication network of the Harlem street that disloyalty had consequences that were not worth the $30. But the damage wasn't really about the 6 collectors. The damage was in what their switching revealed. Costello had a map of Bumpy's operation that was detailed enough to identify the weakest links by name. That kind of map didn't come from surveillance. It came from someone inside the house handing it over. Bumpy began working the problem backward, tracing the leak. But tracing a leak takes time, and Costello was not giving him time. The bookmakers came next. The independent operators, men who ran small betting shops out of barbershops and pool halls, began receiving visits from Costello's representatives, offering them access to a centralized line service that would give them better odds on the numbers draw. The pitch was elegant. Join the downtown network, get protected rates, reduce your exposure to fluctuation. It sounded like a business proposition. It was a business proposition. It was also the slow, systematic removal of the connective tissue that held Bumpy's influence together. By the end of October, 3 of the largest independent bookmakers in Harlem had signed informal agreements with Costello's network. None of them called Bumpy to tell him. They just started operating differently, and the difference was visible to anyone who knew what to look for, which Bumpy did. He sat across from his most trusted lieutenant, a man named Calvin, in the kitchen of a brownstone on 118th Street. Calvin laid out everything he had confirmed on the table between them like evidence at a trial. Bumpy listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Calvin finished, Bumpy said, "He's not trying to take the streets. He's trying to take the definition of the game." Calvin didn't answer, because there was nothing to answer. They both knew what that meant. A man who controlled how the money moved, how the rates were set, and who received protection didn't need to control the corners. He already controlled everything that mattered. The exact figures from those weeks were never written down in any ledger that survived. But the people who moved money through Harlem in those months noticed the same thing independently. Without coordinating their stories, the numbers started flowing in a different direction before anyone understood why. The way a river shifts course underground before the surface shows any change at all. The night of October 17th, 1940 started the way most Thursday nights in Harlem started, with noise. The sound of Lenox Avenue at 11 o'clock was its own particular music, cab horns, a trumpet bleeding out of a second-floor window, women laughing on a stoop, the rhythmic slap of dominoes on a folding table outside a social club. The street was wet from an afternoon rain that had come and gone, and the puddles reflected the orange light of the street lamps in long, wobbling columns. Harlem smelled like it always did after rain clean for about 20 minutes, then slowly returning to itself. All fry grease and brick dust and something sweet and rotten underneath. At 11:17 p.m., the gambling den at 312 Lenox Avenue went dark. Not because of a power failure. The lights in the building next door stayed on. The street lamp outside kept burning. What happened at 312? Lenox was more deliberate and more frightening than an electrical fault. 4 uniformed police officers walked through the front door, and the 43 people inside scattered like pigeons off a ledge. The officers didn't arrest anyone. They didn't need to. They walked through the room slowly, methodically, writing down nothing in particular, touching nothing in particular, and making it absolutely clear that this location was no longer a place where business could be conducted that evening. The operator, a man named Deacon, who had run that room for 11 years, stood at the back wall with his hands loose at his sides and his face completely still. The way a man looks when he is calculating losses in real time. 11 blocks north, at almost exactly the same moment, the den on 123rd Street received its own visitors, not police this time, but something more disorienting. 3 of the 4 card dealers simply stood up, collected their personal items, and walked out the door without explanation. They had been contacted earlier that day and paid 4 weeks of wages to disappear for the night. The room couldn't function without dealers. The 31 bettors inside looked at each other and at the empty chairs and began filing out into the cold air with the confused, deflated energy of people who had dressed up for a party that had been canceled without notice. At 11:41 p.m., the third location, a policy bank operation running out of a dry goods storage room on 127th Street, received a visit from 2 men who were not police and not Costello's soldiers in any formal sense. They were local creditors, men to whom the operator owed money from a debt that had been quietly purchased from its original holder 2 weeks earlier by an intermediary with no obvious connection to downtown. The creditors wanted repayment. Tonight, the operator had the money. Technically, but it was tied up in the float of the current evening's operation, the cash on hand that covered payouts before the day's collection was fully reconciled. Pulling it out to pay the debt would collapse the evening's book. Not paying would mean a confrontation that, in the current atmosphere, no one wanted to be the public face of. The operation closed. The money disappeared into envelopes. The bettors were turned away at the door. 3 gambling dens. 3 different methods, all dark within the same 90-minute window. Bumpy heard about the first one at 11:30. He heard about the second at midnight. By 12:15, when word came of the third, he was already in a car moving through the wet streets of Harlem with Calvin in the back seat beside him and a driver who knew better than to speak. He didn't say much on that ride. Calvin gave him the details in short sentences. The way you brief a man who already understands the structure of what he's hearing and just needs the facts. Bumpy listened. He looked out the window at the street he had spent 20 years learning. At one point he said, quietly, "This wasn't about tonight's money." Calvin said, "No." Bumpy said, "This was about tomorrow morning." He was right. By the time the sun came up over Harlem, the story had already moved through the neighborhood with the speed and distortion that only a night story can travel. Numbers runners heard it before they started their routes. Barbershop owners heard it before they opened. The women who ran the informal information networks of the block, the ones who knew everything and told only what they chose to, they had the full version. With embellishments. By 7 a.m., and the version they told was not about money or police or card dealers who walked off the job. The version they told was about protection, specifically about whether Bumpy Johnson could still provide it. That was the blade. Costello had not sent soldiers. He had sent a signal. Coordinated across 3 locations, delivered in 3 different forms so that it couldn't be traced to a single source or countered with a single response. And the signal said, plainly, to everyone in Harlem who depended on the stability of the underground economy, the man who promised you safety cannot guarantee it tonight. What about tomorrow? Bumpy spent the morning pumping cash into the affected operations and sending word through his network that everything was under control, that this was a test of nerve and nothing more, that anyone who stayed loyal would be protected and compensated. He said it with the calm authority that had defined him for 2 decades. Most people who heard him nodded and said they understood. Some of them were already doing arithmetic. No police report from that night captured what actually happened across those 3 locations. The official record shows routine inspections and nothing more. But the people who were in those rooms, the ones who walked out into the cold air of Lenox Avenue and stood on the wet pavement wondering what had just shifted underneath them, They carried the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. Not because of what they lost, because of what they felt leaving the specific, stomach-dropping sensation of realizing that the ground they had been standing on had been hollow the entire time. The morning after the three dens went dark, Harlem woke up waiting for gunfire that never came. By 9 a.m., every barbershop on 125th Street was running the same conversation. Men sat in chairs with capes around their necks and spoke in low, certain voices about what Bumpy would do next. The consensus was quick and confident there would be retaliation before the week was out. A bookmaker connected to Costello's network would get hit. A message would be sent. That was how these things worked. Had always worked. And the neighborhood understood the grammar of it the way they understood weather. Calvin arrived at Bumpy's apartment on 139th Street at 9:30 with three of the senior lieutenants, Marcus, a broad-shouldered man who had been with Bumpy since the early 30s, Delwood, who ran the collector routes on the east side, and a younger man everyone called Priest because he never raised his voice and never missed. They sat around Bumpy's kitchen table with coffee going cold in their cups and laid out the case for hitting back. Marcus went first. He put both hands flat on the table and spoke like a man who had already decided the outcome before he walked in the door. We let this sit another 48 hours. We don't have a crew anymore. We have employees. There's a difference. Employees go where the money goes. Delwood nodded. 3 locations in one night. If we don't answer that, every independent operator in Harlem is going to read it as permission. Next week, it's 5 locations. The week after that, we're negotiating terms downtown like we're tenants. Priest said nothing. He just watched Bumpy. Bumpy listened to all of it without moving. He sat with his coffee in both hands and his eyes on the middle distance, the way he did when he was running calculations that had too many variables for the room to understand. When Marcus finished, Bumpy set his cup down very carefully and said, "Tell me what happens the morning after we hit one of Costello's bookmakers." Nobody answered immediately. Bumpy continued. The morning after, Costello has a story. He goes to every cop, every judge, every city official he owns, and he owns more of them than we do. That's not a guess. That's arithmetic, and he says Harlem is out of control. He says the uptown operation is a public safety problem. He says the neighborhood needs to be restructured for its own protection. And every politician who's been looking for an excuse to hand Harlem's economy to downtown interests gets the excuse gift-wrapped with a bow on it. He looked at Marcus. You want to pull the trigger so bad. Ask yourself who benefits from the noise. The room was quiet for a long moment. Delwood said, "So we just absorb it." "We don't absorb anything," Bumpy said. "We trace it. Someone gave Costello the schedule for all 3 locations. Someone told him which precincts were bought, which dealers were broke, which creditors could be used. That information didn't come from surveillance. It came from inside this room, or one room very close to it. We find that person before we do anything else. Because right now Costello isn't our biggest problem. Our biggest problem is that we have a hole in the floor and we're still standing on it." He sent them out one by one, with separate instructions, and told them not to compare notes with each other until he said otherwise. It was a technique he had used before when he suspected a leak. Keep the channels separate. Feed slightly different information to different people, and watch where the distortion showed up downstream. What he did not tell them was what his contact at the 28th precinct had told him the night before, in a phone call so brief it barely qualified as a conversation. The sergeant, a man named Briggs who had been on Bumpy's payroll for 6 years, had said, "They're hoping you move first. They have people positioned. Whatever you're thinking about doing, don't do it this week." Bumpy had thanked him and hung up and sat in the dark for an hour. Costello had set a trap so clean it was almost beautiful. Hit back and hand him a justification. Stay still and let the neighborhood's confidence erode. Either move fed the same outcome, Harlem destabilized enough to accept a new structure. The only counter was to refuse both options and find a third path that nobody in the downtown calculation had accounted for. The problem was that refusing both options looked, from the outside, like paralysis. And in the underground economy of Harlem, perception and reality were not different things. They were the same thing. If the street believed Bumpy was frozen, he was frozen. By mid-afternoon, the Whisper Network had already generated two competing theories. The first was that Bumpy was planning something so severe it required more preparation time than usual. The second was that Bumpy had received a communication from downtown that he hadn't shared with his own people, and that the silence was the sound of a negotiation already in progress. The second theory was wrong, but it was gaining ground faster than the first. Bumpy spent the rest of that day not on the street but on the phone, running a different kind of investigation. Not who hit him. Who told them when and how to do it. Several officers who worked that precinct during those years would later mention, in the offhand way that people mention things they were never supposed to know. That the week Harlem went quiet was the same week the arrest reports came back completely clean. No incidents logged. No calls answered. As if the whole neighborhood had agreed to hold still and wait for something none of them could name. That answer, when it came, would change everything. The ledger was small, standard black cover, the kind sold at any stationery shop on Broadway for 30 cents. Inside, written in a tight, careful hand, were 6 weeks of collection schedules, times, addresses, the names of the 2 or 3 people present at each location during the transfer window, and small notations in the margin that indicated which locations had reduced police coverage on which nights. Bumpy held it in his hands for a long time without speaking. Calvin stood across the table from him and watched. He had found the ledger not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, methodical process Bumpy had set in motion 4 days earlier, the separate channels. The slightly varied information fed to different people. The patient observation of where the distortion appeared. What appeared, after 4 days, was a numbers banker named Edmund who had worked with Bumpy for 9 years, who had been at every significant operational meeting for the past 2 years, and who had, 6 weeks ago, begun meeting twice weekly with a man who was later identified as a mid-level representative of Costello's uptown expansion team. Edmund was 53 years old. He had a wife and 2 daughters. He attended church on Sundays at Abyssinian Baptist, sat in the 4th pew, and had once lent Bumpy money during a difficult period in 1934 when the operation was under pressure from a rival. Bumpy had never forgotten that loan. He had repaid it with interest and considered Edmund one of the few men in the operation whose loyalty was structural rather than transactional. He had been wrong about that. "How long?" Bumpy asked. Calvin said, "The contact started 6 weeks ago, but based on what's in the ledger, he had been compiling the information for at least 3 months before that. He wasn't recruited by Costello. He went looking. That was the detail that landed hardest. Not that Edmund had been found and flipped. That was a vulnerability in any organization, a fact of the business that Bumpy had always known and managed for. What was different here was the sequence. Edmund had assembled the intelligence before there was a buyer. He had decided, on his own timeline and for his own reasons, that the current arrangement was one he wanted to exit, and he had prepared his exit package with the same careful attention to detail he brought to every ledger he had ever kept. Bumpy set the book down. He walked to the window and looked out at 118th Street, at the afternoon light falling across the brownstones, at a woman hanging laundry on a fire escape 3 buildings down. He said, "What did they pay him?" Calvin said, "We don't know the full amount. What we found suggests a monthly retainer starting from the first contact, enough to relocate his family comfortably. He was going to leave." "Yes." Bumpy was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he said something that Calvin would repeat for the rest of his life to anyone who asked him what Bumpy Johnson was actually like beneath the reputation. The worst part isn't that he sold us out. The worst part is that he planned it this carefully because he didn't think we'd survive anyway. He wasn't betraying us. He was evacuating. That reframing from betrayal to evacuation changed the nature of the problem entirely. A betrayal could be answered with punishment and the restoration of fear. An evacuation meant something more corrosive. It meant that a man who had been inside the operation for 9 years had looked at it clearly, assessed its long-term viability, and concluded that it was a structure in decline. Costello hadn't corrupted Edmund. Edmund had simply been the first to read the same writing on the wall that Costello had read 2 years earlier, from a downtown office with a map and no pins. Bumpy handled Edmund quietly, as he had promised himself he would. There was no public confrontation, no example made for the benefit of the street. Edmund was removed from the operation, his access cut overnight, his replacement installed before the morning routes ran. A message was communicated through intermediaries that was firm enough to be understood and restrained enough to leave no evidence. Edmund and his family left Harlem within the week. Where they went, nobody said aloud, though Calvin, years later, sitting in a diner on 7th Avenue with someone he trusted, mentioned only that there had been a ledger, and that the ledger went with Edmund, and that whatever else happened after that stayed buried with the man who carried it. The street never got the full story. What it got was a gap where Edmund used to be, and a silence around that gap that everyone understood not to fill with questions. But Bumpy understood something now that he hadn't fully understood before. Costello's move hadn't worked primarily because Costello was powerful, though he was. It had worked because the foundation it targeted was already weakened by years of unexamined cracks, men who were underpaid relative to their risk, loyalty that had been assumed rather than maintained, a structure that Bumpy had stopped stress testing because it had held for so long that testing it seemed unnecessary. The ledger stayed in Bumpy's possession. He never showed it to anyone else in the organization. Some things, he understood, were more dangerous as symbols than as evidence. There is a kind of decision that looks like surrender from every angle, except the one where it was made. And that angle is the one nobody else has access to. Bumpy made his decision on the morning of October 20th, sitting alone in the apartment on 139th Street with the window cracked and the sound of the street coming up from below. He had been awake since 4 a.m. He had made coffee and let it go cold twice. By the time the light changed from gray to pale gold, he had run the same calculation so many times that the variables had stopped feeling like variables and started feeling like certainties. He called Calvin at 7 and said, "Come alone. Tell no one." When Calvin arrived, Bumpy laid it out in plain language, the way he always delivered information he had already decided on, not as a proposal, not as a question, but as a set of facts that had already become true in his mind and now needed to be transmitted to the world. "We're closing the 123rd Street operation. The Lenox Avenue location stays dark. The 127th Street Bank transfers its book to Roosevelt and operates at half volume under a different name. We pull our money out of the 3 independent bookmakers who signed with Costello's network. They're already gone. We just stop pretending otherwise. And we cut Delwood loose." Calvin stared at him. "Delwood's been with you. Delwood has been feeding our scheduling to Edmund for at least 2 months. Not for money, because he thinks the operation is finished and he's trying to land softly. I'm giving him the chance to walk before I have to do something that neither of us wants." He paused. "Tell him I know. Tell him he has until Friday." Calvin sat down heavily in the chair across the table. He was a man who had seen Bumpy make hard decisions for 15 years, and he had learned to read the difference between the ones that cost Bumpy something and the ones that didn't. This one cost him. It was visible in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands. The stillness of a man who has already grieved and moved past it before the conversation started. "They're going to say you folded," Calvin said. "They're going to say whatever keeps them warm," Bumpy said. What they're not going to say is that Costello broke me in public. That's the only story that matters. Everything else is noise. The logic was surgical, and it was cold. If Bumpy fought for every location, he would be fighting on Costello's terms, a prolonged, resource-draining conflict that would bleed the operation dry and give downtown the justification it needed to bring in heavier pressure. Every week of open conflict was a week in which Harlem's underground economy was visibly unstable, and instability invited intervention from forces far larger than Costello: the police, the city, federal attention. Bumpy had watched other operators get swallowed, not by their enemies, but by the chaos their resistance generated. The alternative was to perform the retreat as a choice. Close what needed closing. Protect the core. Maintain enough operational presence that the street understood Bumpy was still in Harlem, still relevant, still a man whose name carried weight. Not the weight of an empire, the weight of someone who had survived when others hadn't, and who had chosen the terms of his own contraction rather than having them chosen for him. It was, in its own brutal way, a form of mastery. But it came at a price that the accounting books would never capture. 43 families in Harlem had depended, directly or indirectly, on the locations Bumpy was now closing. Runners who would lose their routes, operators who would lose their protection, small businesses that had operated in the buffer zone of Bumpy's influence and would now be exposed to a new set of pressures from operators who answered to different bosses with different rules. Bumpy knew every one of those dependencies. He had built them deliberately, because a man with 43 families relying on him was a man with 43 reasons the neighborhood protected him back. Now those same families were the cost of the decision, not its justification. Its cost. He made the calls over the following 2 days, personally, one at a time. He did not send intermediaries. He sat on the phone and told each operator directly what was changing and why, in language that was honest without being complete. He offered what transition support he could. Some people took it with grace. Some didn't. The ones who lived on those blocks still remembered it the same way. Even decades later, not the arguments or the money or the men who came and went. What stayed with them was the lights. How certain windows that had always been lit past midnight started going dark earlier and earlier that week. One by one, quietly. Like a street slowly deciding to go to sleep before it was ready. Because something in the air had already told it the night was over. Costello, downtown, received the reports and said nothing publicly. He didn't need to. The contraction spoke for itself in the language he understood best: numbers, position, and the absence of resistance where resistance had been expected. What he did not receive, and could not purchase, was the thing Bumpy had kept. The name was still on the street. The reputation was still intact. And in Harlem, where memory was the longest-running currency in circulation. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, the only thing that still mattered. The third day arrived the way third days always do in this business, not with noise, but with a clarity so sharp it felt like a blade pressed flat against the back of your neck. Bumpy was dressed and out of the apartment before 6 a.m. He walked 4 blocks south on Lenox Avenue without a car, without Calvin, without anyone. The street was nearly empty at that hour. Just the milk trucks and the sanitation crews and 2 women heading to early shift work with their coats pulled tight against the October cold. He stopped at the corner of 135th Street and stood there for a full minute, looking at the block the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, not seeing what's there, but seeing what shouldn't be. He had made his decision the night before. Now he was just walking through the geometry of it one final time, confirming what he already knew. By 8 a.m. he was back in the apartment with Calvin, Marcus, and a third man named Stiles who handled the financial architecture of the remaining operations, the ledgers, the payout schedules, The reserve accounts that Bumpy had been quietly consolidating for the past 72 hours. 3 brown envelopes sat on the kitchen table. Each one had a name written on the outside in Bumpy's handwriting. He pushed the first envelope toward Stiles. "That's the account information for the 127th Street Reserve. Roosevelt takes it over completely starting Monday. His name, his operation, his risk. We're out entirely." Stiles opened the envelope, looked at the contents, and said nothing. Bumpy pushed the second envelope toward Calvin. "That's the settlement for the Lenox Avenue crew. Every runner, every dealer, every person who worked that location gets paid out in full for 60 days. Not 30, 60. They didn't make this problem and they don't carry it." Calvin picked up the envelope. His jaw was tight. The third envelope Bumpy kept. He folded it once and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. "This one I deliver myself," he said. "This afternoon." Marcus, who had been standing by the window with his arms crossed since the meeting started, finally spoke. "You're closing everything they hit." "I'm closing everything they were about to hit next," Bumpy said. "There's a difference. Closing what they already took makes me a man who lost a fight. Closing what they haven't reached yet makes me a man who decided where the fight ends." Marcus stared at him. The silence between them was the kind that carries 20 years of shared history inside it, too heavy to break quickly. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of the aggression he had walked in with. "They're going to say you quit." "Let them," Bumpy said. "The ones who matter will know what actually happened, and the ones who don't matter never did." He was out the door before Marcus could find an answer for that. The delivery that afternoon was to a man named Patterson who ran the last fully intact operation in the network, a policy bank on 131st Street that had been untouched because it was newer, smaller, and not yet visible enough to be on Costello's map. Bumpy sat across from Patterson in the back of a dry goods store with the smell of cardboard and floor wax around them, and told him exactly what was happening and exactly what it meant. "You're going to get a visit," Bumpy said. "Maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3. Someone in a good suit with a briefcase who talks about margins and protection. When that happens, you listen. You don't say yes, and you don't say no. You say you need time to think. Then you call me." Patterson said, "And what do you do when I call?" Bumpy said, "I tell you whether to take the deal or whether I found another way. But I'm not going to lie to you. There may not be another way. If there isn't, I'll tell you that too." Patterson looked at the envelope on the table between them. "So this is you pulling out. This is me pulling back to where I can hold the line," Bumpy said. "There's a difference between retreating and repositioning. I need you to understand that distinction, because in the next few months, everybody in Harlem is going to have an opinion about what I did this week. And most of those opinions are going to be wrong." He left Patterson with the envelope and walked back out into the October afternoon. The street had the particular quality of light that comes in the last weeks of fall in New York gold, and thin and slightly sad. Like something beautiful that knows it's almost over. Costello's people were watching. Bumpy knew they were watching. 2 men in a parked car on 132nd Street who were not from the neighborhood and were not making any effort to look like they were. He walked past them without acknowledgement, which was itself the message. "I see you, and I'm not afraid of being seen. And whatever you report back downtown tonight, make sure you include that detail." People who were on those streets that afternoon remembered the same specific image for years afterward, a man in a good coat walking alone down Lenox Avenue in the thin October light. Not hurrying, not looking over his shoulder, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had already decided that the worst had happened and found it survivable. They remembered it because it didn't look like defeat. It looked like something harder to name and harder to answer. In a world where most men lost everything fighting to hold what was already gone. That distinction was everything. By the first week of November 1940, Frank Costello's reorganization of Harlem's numbers economy was functionally complete. The three new collection supervisors he had installed, efficient men, punctual men, men who wore clean shirts and kept accurate records and had no personal attachment to any block they worked, had established routes covering approximately 70% of the territory that Bumpy's network had occupied 3 weeks earlier. The payout rates were standardized. The police arrangements had been renegotiated at a precinct level, with new envelopes going to new hands. The old relationships dissolved without ceremony. On paper, the transition was nearly seamless. Costello reviewed the weekly summary in his downtown office on a Tuesday morning and made 2 small notations in the margin with a fountain pen. The numbers were good. The structure was clean. The resistance had been, in the end, negligible. A few days of uncertainty, one contraction that had been anticipated, and then a quiet that confirmed the operation had succeeded without requiring anything that would leave a visible mark. He poured coffee from a silver pot on the corner of his desk and sat back and allowed himself, briefly, the particular satisfaction of a problem solved elegantly. What his weekly summary did not capture, could not capture, because it had no column, for it was what was happening on the street level in Harlem at that same moment. At a barbershop on 128th Street, 2 men were arguing about whether Bumpy had been run out or had walked out, and the argument had the specific, heated quality of a disagreement that both parties knew would never be fully resolved. At a lunch counter on 7th Avenue, a woman who had worked as a numbers runner for 8 years was explaining to a younger woman what the difference felt like between the old operation and the new one. Before, you knew the man whose money you were carrying. Now you're just carrying money. At Abyssinian Baptist, a deacon mentioned during a Wednesday evening service that the neighborhood felt different lately, heavier somehow. And the congregation nodded in the specific way that people nod when they recognize a truth that they hadn't found the words for themselves. None of this showed up in Costello's summary. But it was real, and it was accumulating. Bumpy, meanwhile, had made himself deliberately scarce in a way that was itself a form of presence. He was seen at his regular restaurant table, at a few social functions, on certain corners at certain hours, but less than before, and always briefly, and always in a way that gave the street just enough to work with. He said little. He made no public statements about what had happened. He did not appear diminished, but he did not appear to be rebuilding in any visible way either. He occupied a space that was precisely calibrated between gone and here, and the ambiguity of that position was, by design, unsettling to everyone who needed to know which category he belonged to. Costello's new operators felt it most directly. 3 of them, within the first 2 weeks, sent word back through the chain that there was friction on their routes, not violence, not confrontation, but a particular quality of cooperation from the neighborhood. People who had always paid on time began paying late. Runners who had agreed to transition into the new structure began calling in sick on collection days. Small, individually insignificant frictions that, taken together, added up to a resistance that had no face and no address and couldn't be answered with a conversation or a threat. One of the new supervisors, a capable man named Garrick, who had successfully reorganized 2 other operations for Costello in Brooklyn, sat down with his contact in the downtown network after his 3rd difficult week and said, with genuine puzzlement in his voice, "I don't understand what I'm fighting. There's nobody pushing back. The money comes in, mostly, but it feels like working in a building where someone left a window open that you can't find. You can't see it, but you feel it every minute you're inside." That description traveled up the chain and landed on a desk downtown, where it was read and set aside. But the people who actually lived and worked on those Harlem blocks understood exactly what Garrick was feeling. even if they would never have said it to his face. They knew what that open window was. It had a name, and the fact that this name was still spoken, still present in the air of every room where the new operators tried to conduct business, was the most complete answer Bumpy Johnson ever gave to the question of whether he had truly lost. Costello had the streets. He had the routes and the collection schedules and the standardized payout rates and the new police arrangements. He had, by any measurable standard, won. What he had not won, and what no amount of reorganization could purchase, was the simple fact that Harlem still spoke Bumpy Johnson's name in the present tense. Not as history, not as a cautionary tale, as someone still in the room, even when he wasn't visible, and in a neighborhood whose entire economy ran on trust, on reputation, on the belief that the person behind the money was someone whose word meant something. That distinction was not sentimental. It was structural, and it was the one thing Costello's summary had no column for. Harlem in December 1940 looked, to any outside observer, like a neighborhood that had found its equilibrium. The street violence that some had predicted, the retaliatory strikes, the turf wars, the open confrontations between the old network and the new had not materialized in any significant form. The numbers game continued to run. Money continued to move. The barbershops and lunch counters and church basements that had always served as the connective tissue of the neighborhood's informal economy were still open, still functioning, still full of people doing the small, essential transactions of daily life. From the outside, the crisis of October looked like a brief disturbance that had resolved itself cleanly. From the inside, it felt like the morning after a surgery, functional, technically successful, and carrying a specific kind of ache in places that didn't show. Costello's new structure was efficient in the way that imported systems are always efficient when first installed. It worked according to its own law, which was the logic of scale and standardization and maximum extraction with minimum friction. The payout rates were reliable. The collection schedules ran on time. The police arrangements held. What the new structure lacked, what it could not manufacture, regardless of how well it was designed, was the quality that Bumpy's operation had spent 15 years building, the sense that the money flowing through Harlem was being managed by people who lived there, who had children in those schools, who attended those churches, who would be on those same streets in 20 years and would carry the consequences of their decisions in their own bodies. Costello's operators were professionals. They were also strangers, and Harlem, which had been surviving on the margins of a legal economy for generations, had learned to feel that difference in its bones. The small operators who had filled the vacuum left by Bumpy's contraction were already showing the strains that come with sudden, unearned elevation. 3 new policy bankers had emerged to claim territory that Bumpy's network had vacated, each one younger and less seasoned than the situation required. They moved fast and talked loudly and made promises they didn't yet have the infrastructure to keep. By mid-November, 2 of them were already in conflict with each other over overlapping routes, the kind of conflict that generates noise and draws attention and eventually forces the larger power to intervene and absorb them both. Costello watched this process with the patience of a man who had seen it many times. He did not intervene immediately. He let the smaller operators exhaust themselves, then sent in his people to offer mediation that was, in practice, consolidation. It was the same method he had used on Bumpy, scaled down and applied to men who had neither Bumpy's intelligence nor his restraint. The outcome was faster and considerably messier. Bumpy watched it too, from his calibrated distance, and said nothing publicly. But Calvin, who was with him on the afternoon the last of the 3 new operators folded into Costello's network, said that Bumpy looked out the window for a long time without speaking, and then said only, "That's what it looks like when someone takes a neighborhood without understanding what they took." Calvin asked him what he meant. Bumpy said, "Costello's running Harlem now the same way a bank runs a building it foreclosed on. He owns it on paper. He doesn't know where the boiler is. It was, as observations go, accurate. The new structure functioned, but it functioned the way all absentee systems function adequately at the surface level. Poorly at the level where things actually broke down and needed someone who understood the specific, irreplaceable texture of the place to fix them. The small frictions that Garrick and the other operators had reported in November did not resolve. They accumulated. Routes that should have been simple became complicated. Collections that should have been reliable became inconsistent. The invisible negotiation between the operators and the neighborhood the constant, unspoken calibration of how much pressure a community will absorb before it finds ways to route around the pressure was tilting in a direction that Costello's weekly summaries were not designed to detect. What the written record from that period shows is thin, deliberately so precinct logs with gaps where there should be entries, property transfers that move too cleanly to be accidental, ledgers that stop mid-page and resume in different handwriting. The people who managed those documents knew exactly what they were doing. The history of Harlem in those months was never meant to be read by outsiders, and the ones who lived it made sure of that. What survived did so not in filing cabinets, but in the mouths of people who understood that some stories are safer as memory than as evidence. What the oral record agrees on, what every version of the story, from every vantage point, circles back to, is the question of what Bumpy Johnson had actually lost and what he had actually kept. He had lost operations, locations, revenue, the daily texture of running a machine that employed dozens of people and touched hundreds more. That loss was real, and it was significant, and anyone who pretended otherwise was being sentimental in a way that Bumpy himself would have rejected. What he had kept was harder to quantify, but more durable. He had kept the narrative, the story of a man who looked at an impossible position and made a choice on his own terms, rather than having the choice made for him. He had kept the loyalty of the people who understood what that choice had cost. And he had kept, in the precise and unforgiving accounting of street reputation, the one thing that no reorganization can manufacture and no weekly summary can capture, the particular, irreplaceable weight of a name that the neighborhood still said with a certain quality of voice. Costello had proven that you could take a neighborhood by attacking its systems rather than its people. Bumpy had proven that you could survive that attack by understanding the difference between what could be taken and what couldn't. Neither of them had saved Harlem. One had reorganized it. One had contracted within it. The neighborhood itself. The actual people. The families on those streets. The runners and dealers and church deacons and women hanging laundry on fire escapes had done what it had always done. Adapted, endured, and kept its own counsel about what had really happened and what it meant. Power doesn't always announce itself with gunfire. Sometimes it announces itself with silence. And sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is be the one who decides when the silence begins. The old order didn't end with gunfire. It ended with a decision colder than any bullet ever cast. Costello got Harlem on the map. Bumpy lost the operation but kept the one thing no one could take his name. Spoken in the present tense on every corner that mattered. One man built an empire through calculation. The other burned his own bridge before anyone else could cross it. Neither of them saved the neighborhood. They just chose the price they were willing to pay. That question never really leaves you if it was your corner, your name, your life's work on the line. Would you fight and bleed or walk away still standing? If this story moved you, subscribe. There are more nights like this one waiting.